What happens when a Hollywood legend refuses to play by the rules of modern television? The answer came on a night when millions of viewers expected a light-hearted interview. A few nostalgic anecdotes, and the usual effortless charm that late-night TV has served up for decades. But within minutes, the atmosphere inside ABC's studio in Hollywood shifted. In less than 20 minutes. A comedy show would transform into a battlefield. The audience had arrived eager for laughter. They wanted to see Harrison Ford, the man who flew the Millennium Falcon, cracked Indiana Jones's whip, and carried an entire generation's cinematic dreams on his shoulders. At 81, Ford was supposed to smile, tell a couple of war stories from the set, and maybe throw in a self-deprecating joke about aging. Instead, he would deliver something far more explosive. Jimmy Kimmel. The veteran host, with a razor-sharp grin and a knack for keeping conversations smooth, thought he was in control. For 2 decades, he had turned tense topics into punchlines, uncomfortable silences into applause breaks. But this wasn't going to be another neatly packaged segment. He was about to push a man who had built his career not on pleasing crowds, but on commanding them. And that was the moment everything changed. Ford wasn't here to promote his film in the usual way. He wasn't here to stroke the ego of late-night TV or play the game of manufactured sound bites. He came carrying something heavier than promotions, something unflinching. The silence that would fall upon that studio wasn't scripted. The confrontation that would unfold wasn't part of any segment rundown. And when Ford finally stood up and walked off set, the world witnessed not just a guest leaving an interview, but a cultural collision. The clash of old Hollywood grit against new Hollywood politics. Raw authenticity against rehearsed morality. The legend refused to play along. And late-night television would never look the same. The night began like any other episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live. A buzzing studio audience packed into the familiar late-night set. Their laughter and chatter formed a nervous hum under the stage lights. The band played its brassy riffs. Cameras rolled in practiced arcs, and producers behind the glass nodded with satisfaction. Everything was set for another night of laughter and easy entertainment. Then he walked in. Harrison Ford, at 81 years old. He carried himself with a presence that silenced even the most distracted fans in the audience. Time had etched lines into his face, but his stoic demeanor remained unshaken. Every step he took onto that stage carried the weight of a man who had lived through more than half a century in Hollywood's trenches. He didn't need to smile to command respect. He just needed to be. Jimmy Kimmel, perched behind his desk, knew the assignment well. His grin was wide, his voice booming with enthusiasm. Ladies and gentlemen, the man, the myth, the legend, Harrison Ford, he declared. The crowd exploded in applause. It was a classic Kimmel moment. Hype, humor, and a little reverence, all neatly wrapped in his signature showmanship. Ford gave the audience a small nod. Nothing flashy. Nothing exaggerated, just enough to acknowledge them before sinking into the guest chair. The contrast was immediate. Kimmel radiated charm, constantly in motion, while Ford sat still, understated, like a monolith against a storm. The first few minutes unfolded smoothly. Kimmel played to Ford's history, asking about his latest film project. Ford obliged with clipped but polite answers. They exchanged light-hearted banter about working with directors, about the old injuries Ford had famously accumulated on set. Each story landed with a familiar rhythm, the audience chuckling, Kimmel tossing in a punchline. Ford delivering his trademark gravelly voice that carried the weight of lived experience. The air was warm, comfortable, familiar. It was late-night television as it had always been. But beneath the surface, something was off. There was a subtle sharpness in Ford's eyes, a glint that didn't match the casual banter. When Kimmel laughed, Ford didn't always laugh back. When the audience roared, Ford seemed to let it wash over him, detached, almost analytical. He wasn't basking in the glow of nostalgia or leaning into the easy comfort of celebrity. He was waiting. The audience didn't sense it yet, lulled into the safety of routine. Kimmel didn't see it either, confident in his ability to guide any guest down the path of laughter and applause. But Ford, he knew this wasn't going to be just another promotional appearance. This wasn't going to be just another charming night on late-night TV. Harrison Ford wasn't here to play along. The rhythm of the interview began to change. Up until this moment, Jimmy Kimmel had kept the tone light, tossing out stories and jokes with the ease of a man who had done this thousands of times before. But then his grin shifted, less playful, more deliberate. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing just slightly, and asked the question that would ignite the night. "You know," Harrison Kimmel began, his voice deceptively casual, "you've been in this business for over 5 decades. You've seen Hollywood change. What do you think about the way the industry handles controversial figures these days?" The words dropped into the studio like a stone into still water. The atmosphere rippled instantly. Ford didn't move at first. He sat in silence, jaw tight, hands resting on the arms of his chair. But the subtle shift was undeniable. His fingers curled slightly, gripping the wood as though anchoring himself. His eyes, shadowed by the stage lights, hardened. "What do you mean by that, Jimmy?" His voice was low, even, but there was steel beneath it. Kimmel leaned forward, sensing the shift. "Well, we've seen actors, directors, celebrities, people facing consequences for things they've said or done. Some call it accountability. Others call it cancel culture. You've never been shy about speaking your mind. Do you ever worry about saying the wrong thing?" The question hung in the air. Too long. The audience, still holding smiles from the earlier jokes, froze. A few shifted in their seats, as if instinctively aware the temperature in the room had just risen. Ford's grip tightened, his gaze locked on Kimmel, unblinking. And then he spoke. "I think people should be able to express their opinions," he said carefully, each word measured, without fear of having their careers destroyed by a mob mentality. The reaction was immediate, but not vocal. No laughs, no applause, just silence. A heavy, unsettling silence that rolled across the room. Kimmel's eyebrows rose slightly, his grin taking on a sharper edge. He sensed an opening, the possibility of a viral moment. "That's interesting," he pressed, his tone still wrapped in showman's charm, but edged with something harder. "So, you think some of the people who face consequences didn't deserve it? Because we're not just talking about unpopular opinions, Harrison. Some of these cases involve serious allegations." The words were deliberate. Loaded. Ford shifted in his chair, leaning forward ever so slightly. His voice dropped lower, his gravelly tone carrying a quiet intensity that filled the space. "I'm talking about the principle, Jimmy," he said, measured but firm. "There's a difference between holding people accountable for genuine wrongdoing and destroying someone's livelihood because they made a mistake years ago or because their opinion doesn't fit the popular narrative." The studio was no longer an audience enjoying a comedy show. It was a courtroom, a battleground. Every eye was locked on the two men at center stage. In that instant, the interview transformed. This wasn't late-night entertainment anymore. This was the spark, the first shot fired in a war of words that would burn hotter and louder with every exchange. The pleasantries were gone. The real fight had just begun. The silence hung thick in the studio like smoke after an explosion. Jimmy Kimmel's trademark grin flickered, no longer playful. It carried a trace of unease, as though he realized his guest wasn't going to give him the easy viral soundbite he'd been fishing for. Still, he pressed forward, leaning into his desk like a man determined to hold his ground. "But Harrison," he said, voice firmer now, "don't you think actors and celebrities, people in positions of influence, have a responsibility to be careful about what they say, especially when it comes to sensitive topics. Ford's eyes narrowed. His voice was steady, but the undercurrent of steel was unmistakable. Careful, according to who? His gravelly tone cut through the quiet like a blade. You, the Twitter mob, some corporate boardroom, or maybe an algorithm written by 20 programmers in Silicon Valley. The question landed like a punch. The audience, which had been chuckling along moments earlier, fell dead silent. A few people shifted uneasily in their seats, as if they'd wandered into a conversation they weren't supposed to witness. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged nervous glances. Someone in the control room muttered about cutting to commercial, but the red light above the cameras stayed on. The show was still live, and every second of this was being broadcast to millions. Kimmel's smile thinned, his tone sharpened. I wouldn't call it a Twitter mob, he countered. I'd call it accountability. When people use their platform to spread harmful ideologies, there have to be consequences. Ford leaned forward, his frame casting a shadow across the desk. And who decides what qualifies as harmful, Jimmy? His words were like a strike. Who gets to sit in judgment? You, the network executives, or is it talk show hosts pretending they're arbiters of morality? The tension in the room was palpable, not just invisible, but vibrating in the air, charged like static before a thunderstorm. The camera zoomed in tighter, sensing that this was no ordinary interview. The atmosphere crackled with electricity, as if the studio itself had become a powder keg, waiting for a spark. Kimmel's jaw tightened, his voice rising slightly, his entertainer's mask slipping away. We can all agree that racism, sexism, and bigotry are wrong. When public figures promote those things, they should face consequences. That's not controversial. That's common sense. Kimmel's voice was steady. But Ford cut in before he could finish, sharp and decisive. Ford's words sliced through the tension in the studio. There you go again, Ford shot back, defining the terms of the debate so they always work in your favor. Kimmel's face flushed. The usual rhythm of his show was gone. This was no longer an interview, it was a confrontation. His hands clenched on the desk, eyes locked with Ford's. I'm not defining anything, Kimmel retorted. I'm pointing out that harmful behavior deserves pushback. That's how society works. Ford straightened, his expression darkening as his gravelly voice carried across the room with deadly clarity. Society. Or is it just your corner of Hollywood? Because where I come from, society isn't defined by groupthink in Malibu mansions or boardrooms deciding who's acceptable this week. The audience gasped. They weren't watching a celebrity interview anymore, they were witnessing a duel. Kimmel's eyes widened, his voice rising with a sense of urgency. That's rich, coming from someone who's made millions playing heroes who solve problems with violence. Maybe you're just uncomfortable with the idea that the real world requires more nuance than your movies. Ford's eyes flashed with intensity, his voice calm but threatening. Don't lecture me about nuance. Jimmy, don't pretend that what you're doing here is anything more than performance art. You reduce complex issues to punchlines. You build divisions where there could be understanding. You make your audience feel superior to people they've never even met. The words hit hard, and Kimmel leaned forward, his voice cracking. I'm trying to have real conversations, honest ones. Maybe that makes you uncomfortable, Harrison. Maybe you've spent so long hiding behind characters that you don't know how to handle the truth anymore. Ford rose slightly in his chair, towering over Kimmel. At least when I play a character, I'm honest about it. I don't sit behind a desk every night pretending to be some moral authority. The tension in the room was suffocating. The audience was frozen in place. No laughter, no applause. Just the hum of the cameras and the growing realization that this was a historic moment. Kimmel's bravado faltered. His face paled, his fists clenching tighter. You're just another privileged Hollywood elite defending bigotry because it doesn't touch you. You represent everything wrong with old Hollywood. Ford's lips curled into a smirk. Let me tell you something about old Hollywood, Jimmy. We made art, not propaganda. We told stories, not sermons. We respected our audiences. We didn't lecture them. We trusted them to think for themselves. Kimmel's face reddened, his gaze flickering between Ford and the crowd. Ford's words had struck a chord. There was no comeback left. The air in the studio was thick with tension. And as Ford slowly stood up, the silence was deafening. He towered over Kimmel, his presence commanding attention. I've spent 50 years earning the trust of audiences. Ford's voice rang out. I've risked my life, put my body on the line, broken bones to give them something real, something honest. And what do, Jimmy? You sit behind that desk every night, passing judgment, turning complex issues into punchlines. Kimmel was caught off guard. Ford's words were like sharp blows, and as Kimmel tried to respond, Ford silenced him with a deadly calm. You call it accountability, Jimmy, but what you really do is destroy. Destroy reputations, careers, discourse, because it makes for good television. The audience was entranced, witnessing a moment that would become legendary. Ford's voice continued, low and steady. Real strength isn't tearing people down. It's building them up, and that's something you'll never understand. Kimmel tried to salvage the conversation, his voice rising in desperation. I use my platform to fight for what's right, to call out hatred, to give a voice to the voiceless. That's more than hiding behind movie roles and staying silent when it matters. Ford's laugh was sharp and humorless, his presence overwhelming. Staying silent. Don't you dare lecture me about silence. I fought my battles in the real world long before you ever sat behind this desk. Kimmel faltered, his face contorting with anger and frustration. You think because you've lived longer, because you've played heroes, that makes you some authority on moral courage. Ford's voice dropped to a whisper, each word dripping with menace. I don't need to destroy others to feel important. I don't need to paint everyone who disagrees with me as a monster to win an argument. Real strength isn't tearing people down. It's building them up. Kimmel froze, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. Ford straightened, his movements deliberate, reclaiming control. He turned to face the audience, his voice steady and resonant. You came here tonight for entertainment, not to sit through lectures. And the fault for that lies with those who confuse celebrity with wisdom. Ford's final words hung in the air as he turned to leave. The studio was paralyzed in silence. Kimmel, defeated, tried to call out, but Ford was already gone. The audience remained frozen, witnessing the end of the era of celebrity-driven television and the birth of a new, raw form of truth-telling.